Unlike every other major world religion, Jesus did not have an army. He did not have any culture backing him. The culture was against him. He was not mainstream. He was definitely the underdog. He didn't have any wealth at all. He didn't have any royalty. He didn't have an empire behind him. Like, it makes sense how the other world religions spread, if you think about it, right? It makes total sense how Islam spread. Muhammad was a warlord. He had an army. They invaded and they conquered and they forced people to convert to their religion. That's how it spread. Even to this day, the way it spreads, he doesn't have a conquering anymore, but it's spreading by birth rate. That's how Islam is growing today. It's not growing by conversions. It's not growing by people believing in it. It's growing by them they just have a lot of babies. That makes sense to me. That makes sense how that world religion would spread. It makes sense to me how Buddhism would spread. That makes sense. I understand that. You know, Siddhartha, the Buddha, he was a prince. He was literal royalty. He had immense wealth and cultural significance behind him. That makes sense how a lot of people would get on board with that and would believe that. It would also make sense how that religion almost stayed exclusively contained in the Far East. It didn't go beyond the influence of that culture. Not really. It makes sense how Hinduism would grow, right? They just say yes to every god. Just everyone gets in, right? Jesus, you're in. You know, Vishnu, you're in. You know, Krishna, everyone's in. You know, they just say yes. That makes sense. I can see everyone just, there's no rules to it. All the religions say yes to this. The Jesus message, that doesn't make sense though. You might say, well, Christianity had the armies too, and they spread by force, and they had all the empires and the kingdoms. That wasn't until hundreds of years after the time of Jesus. For the first 300 years, Christianity was illegal. You had the most powerful empire in the world trying everything they could to stop this Jesus movement with all of their military might and all of their sophisticated apparatus and all of their wealth trying to stop it, and they could not. They could not stop it. The message spread like wildfire. Even still today. You know, today Christianity is the largest religion in the world, and it is still growing. We see in parts of the world where Christianity is illegal, every time they relax the laws and they let people believe what they want to believe, we see people flooding to Christianity. You know, some of the fastest growing parts of Christianity are in Asia, in parts of Asia and the Middle East. Every time they relax the laws. Christianity is not, we have the lowest birth rates in the world in the places that are primarily Christian, but it's still growing because of conversions, because people are hearing the message and they're believing and they're trusting in Jesus and they're following him. That doesn't make sense from a worldly point of view. That doesn't make sense, especially in those first 300 years. That makes no sense. He was a nobody with nothing behind him. He had no money. He had no might. But he had a message. And everyone who knew him said that he rose from the dead. Everyone who knew him said that he came back. And many of those people died saying that he rose from the dead, that he was the Christ, the Son of the living God. He was a nobody with nothing. And this nobody with nothing has become the most influential person who has ever lived in all of human history. Jesus is the most influential person who has ever lived in all of human history. There is not one single person that you can point to that has more influence on planet Earth than Jesus. Not one single. Who could you think of? Who is one individual that has been more influential on planet Earth than Jesus? You think of all the kings who have ever reigned. None of them have had more influence in this world than Jesus. You think of all the armies that have ever marched and all the navies that have ever sailed. None of them have had the impact that Jesus has had. You think of all the empires that have risen and fallen. None of them have had the impact that Jesus has had. You think of all the social movements and all the cultural awakenings. None of them come close to the movement of Jesus. None of them have had more influence than Jesus. You know, he only taught for 3 years. It was only 3 years. And yet he is more famous than Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates combined. Those were brilliant men. Those are some of the most brilliant men this world has ever seen. Brilliant philosophers. Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. How many people can quote them? Some. Not very many. How many people today are quoting the words of Jesus? A lot. Man, there's something to him. There's something in his message. Whole civilizations have been built on the teachings of Jesus. There are more songs that have been sung about him than any other person in history. More words have been written about him in literature and poetry than any other person in history. There's been more art created about Jesus than any other person in history. More lives have been shaped by Jesus than any other person in history. More people are following him today than any other movement in all of history for anything. Billions of people today are gathered right now, right at this very moment, proclaiming that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, who died for our sins and rose again. There's been more research and more scrutiny towards Jesus than any other person. Who else has faced the scrutiny that he has? And yet 20 centuries later, his critics still cannot erase him from history. No matter what enlightenments or great awakenings happen. You know Jesus is revered in every major religion in the world. Did you know that? Did you know in Islam he's considered the prophet Isa? They respect him. Do you know in Hinduism he's considered by many to be an avatar? In Buddhism he's considered to be an enlightened holy man. Even in Judaism he's considered to be a respected rabbi. I don't know about you, but if God were to become a person, I would expect him to be exactly like that. Who is Jesus really?